They didn't push her out of the spotlight, she simply stopped existing in it. The ballroom glowed in soft gold, chandeliers scattering light across polished marble like something sacred, but Sophia Bennett stood just beneath it, unnoticed, a silhouette among silhouettes, her black dress simple, almost deliberate in its quiet refusal to compete, while laughter rose and fell around her in waves that never quite reached where she stood. And somewhere near the center of it all, Ryan Cole lifted a glass, his voice smooth, confident, practiced, introducing the woman beside him. As if she were the only story worth telling, as if the years before her had never happened, as if Sophia had never stood next to him under a different light. Years ago, when applause had belonged to both of them, a server brushed past Sophia without apology, a tray of champagne catching the light she never received, and she stepped half an inch back, not startled, just adjusting, as though she had learned to make space where none was offered, her eyes steady, not searching, not hoping, just observing, the way someone does when they've already understood their place in the room and accepted it without surrendering to it. Across the floor, Ryan laughed again, louder this time, his hand resting at the small of his new wife's back, guiding her gently into conversations that opened for her like doors that had once opened for Sophia, and for a brief second, the music dipped low enough that silence threaded through the space, thin and sharp, and in that silence, Sophia's reflection flickered in the mirrored wall, present, but distant, like a memory the room had chosen to forget. No one called her name. No one asked who she was, and when a woman near the bar glanced at her with polite confusion, it lingered just long enough to say everything without a word, and Sophia simply offered a small, almost invisible smile in return, not defensive, not wounded, just final, as if she had already closed a chapter no one else realized had ended. And above it all, the spotlight shifted slightly, drifting across faces that leaned into its warmth, never quite landing on her, not yet, but it moved, slowly, almost thoughtfully, as if it were searching, remembering something it hadn't seen in a long time. The music shifted into something softer, a piano melody that drifted like a memory no one quite held onto, and Sophia remained where she was, still at the edge of everything, her fingers lightly touching the stem of a glass she had not lifted, as if even the act of drinking would require acknowledgment she had not been given. And across the room, Ryan leaned closer to a group of investors, his voice low and confident, the kind of tone that once belonged to late nights at their kitchen table, when ambition had been shared between them, not performed for others. And for a moment, the sound of his laughter overlapped with another version of him, quieter, uncertain, asking Sophia if they were ready to risk everything for something bigger. And she had said yes without hesitation, because back then, the light had felt like something they were building together, not something that could be taken. Her gaze did not linger on him now, not really, it passed over him the way light passes over glass, without holding, without warmth, and instead, it settled briefly on the stage at the far end of the ballroom, where a microphone stood alone, waiting untouched, the kind of waiting that felt intentional, like a pause written into the night. A faint reflection of that stage flickered again in the mirrored wall beside her, and this time, it caught more than just her outline. It caught the way she stood, steady, composed, unchanged by the absence around her, and somewhere deep beneath the quiet, something older than the evening itself stirred, not anger, not regret, but recognition, as if the version of her that once belonged to that stage had never disappeared, only stepped out of sight. A passing guest brushed shoulders with her, offering a quick apology that dissolved before it fully formed, and Sophia nodded once, graceful, unbothered, her presence still too soft for the room to hold on to, and yet, just above the crowd, the spotlight shifted again, slower this time, more deliberate, tracing across faces, lingering a fraction longer with each movement, as though it were searching through layers of noise and memory, trying to recall a name it had not spoken in years, and though no one noticed the change, not yet, Sophia felt it, not as warmth, but as a quiet pull, like something unseen had begun to turn in her direction, patient, certain, inevitable. A faint chime echoed through the room, soft but precise, the kind of sound that signaled a transition no one questioned, and conversations began to fold into themselves, voices lowering, glasses settling against white linen tables. As attention slowly turned toward the stage, and Sophia did not move, not yet, her posture unchanged, her presence still resting quietly at the edge, but her eyes lifted just slightly, following the subtle shift in energy the way one notices a change in weather. Before the sky fully responds, across the ballroom, Ryan adjusted his jacket, his expression sharpening with interest, already leaning into whatever recognition the evening might offer him, while the woman beside him mirrored the same expectation. Her smile prepared, her posture angled toward the light as if it were something that could be claimed by standing close enough. The host stepped onto the stage, his voice warm, practiced, filling the room with ease as he spoke about achievement. Resilience, stories worth telling, words that drifted through the air like familiar promises, and Sophia listened without reaction, her face calm, almost distant, yet something beneath that calm had begun to settle into place, something steady, unshaken. Like a foundation that no longer needed to prove it could hold. A server passed again, this time slower, placing a fresh glass near her without asking, and she accepted it with a small nod, her fingers wrapping around it not out of habit, but presence, as if she had chosen, finally, to stand fully where she was. The spotlight moved once more, brighter now, more focused, sweeping across the audience in a measured arc, touching shoulders, faces, expectations, and, for a brief second, it paused near Ryan, catching the edge of his confident smile, before continuing forward, unclaimed, unresolved, and Sophia exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, not in anticipation, not in doubt, but in recognition, as though she understood something the room had not yet realized, that the light was not searching for importance, it was searching for truth, and somewhere between the silence she had carried and the life she had rebuilt, that truth had never left her, only waited for the moment it would no longer be ignored. The applause began softly, almost polite, as the host continued speaking, his voice steady and assured, introducing stories of resilience that sounded distant to most, but landed somewhere deeper for her. And while the room leaned forward in anticipation of names they expected to hear, Sophia's mind drifted backward, not to the ballroom, but to a much smaller space. A one-bedroom apartment where the ceiling light flickered every other night and the sound of the city came through thin windows that never quite closed properly. Mornings there had started before sunrise, with quiet footsteps across a worn kitchen floor, the hum of a coffee maker that took longer than it should, and a small hand reaching for hers as her child waited sleepily at the edge of the day, trusting her without question. And she had moved through those mornings without an audience, without applause, building something steady out of moments no one ever saw. Measuring time not in recognition but in persistence, in bills paid on time, in lunches packed, in nights when exhaustion pressed heavy, but she never let it show. There had been days when silence felt louder than any crowd, when the absence of her name in rooms like this one had echoed longer than she expected. But she had learned to fill that silence differently, with quiet decisions, with work that spoke only through results, with a version of herself that did not ask to be seen, only to be real, and somewhere along that path, without announcement, without permission, she had become someone else entirely, someone who no longer stood in the shadow of what was lost, but in the quiet certainty of what was built. Back in the ballroom, the light shifted again, brighter now, tracing its slow arc across the audience with more intention, as if the evening itself had reached a turning point, and Ryan leaned slightly forward, expectation sharpening in his eyes, ready to claim whatever recognition came next, unaware that the moment had already moved beyond him, and Sophia, still composed, still silent, felt the distance between who she had been and who she was now settle into something unshakable, not a gap, but a bridge, one she had crossed alone, step by step, long before anyone thought to look her way. The host's voice softened as he transitioned, no longer speaking in broad strokes, but in something more precise, more intentional, describing a story not of sudden success, but of quiet endurance. Of a woman who rebuilt her life piece by piece without asking anyone to notice, and while most of the room listened politely, waiting for a name they could recognize, Sophia felt each word land with a clarity that did not surprise her. Only confirmed something she had already lived through, a subtle movement near her caught her attention as a man stepped into the edge of her space, not close enough to intrude, but close enough to be present, his posture calm, his expression unreadable yet steady, and without looking directly at her at first. He simply stood there as if the noise around them did not concern him, and when his gaze finally met hers, it held no curiosity, no judgment, only recognition, the kind that did not need explanation. Victor Hale did not ask who she was. He did not offer small talk or polite introductions. He only inclined his head slightly, a quiet acknowledgment that felt more real than anything else in the room, and Sophia returned it with the same measured grace, neither surprised nor drawn, simply aware. As if their presence in the same space was not coincidence, but alignment. Across the ballroom, Ryan's attention remained fixed on the stage, his anticipation growing as the description continued, unaware of the shift happening beyond his line of sight, unaware that the story unfolding was no longer one he could step into. The spotlight moved again, slower now, narrowing as it traced the audience, and for the first time, it did not sweep past Sophia. It hovered, just briefly, not fully claiming her yet, but no longer ignoring her and Victor's voice, low and steady, broke the silence between them with a single sentence, spoken as if it had always been true. You were never meant to disappear, and Sophia did not respond with words. She did not need to, because in the stillness of that moment, something had already shifted, not in how the world saw her, but in how the light itself had begun to remember where it belonged. The room held its breath without realizing it, the kind of quiet that forms just before something irreversible happens, and the host's voice, now slower, more deliberate, began to narrow the story into details that no longer felt distant or abstract. Speaking of late nights under dim kitchen lights, of a woman who rebuilt her life not in grand gestures, but in steady, invisible steps, and somewhere in the middle of those words, a subtle shift moved through the audience, a ripple of recognition that had not yet reached the surface. Sophia stood exactly where she had been, but nothing about her felt the same, not because she had changed in that moment, but because the space around her had begun to adjust. As if the room itself was catching up to a truth that had been present all along, and beside her, Victor remained still, his presence grounding rather than commanding, his silence more defining than any introduction could be. Across the ballroom, Ryan's expression tightened slightly. Not with understanding, but with the faint discomfort of something unfamiliar, his confidence still intact but no longer effortless, as though the narrative he expected had begun to slip just beyond his reach, the spotlight no longer drifting. Slowed to a near stop, its beam tightening with intention as it traced one final path across the audience, passing over faces that leaned forward in anticipation, until it reached the edge where Sophia stood, and this time, it did not move on, it settled. Quiet and certain, illuminating her not with spectacle, but with clarity, revealing nothing more than what had always been there. A murmur moved through the crowd, soft but growing, as attention shifted, not abruptly, but inevitably. And for the first time that evening, Sophia did not remain at the edge. She stepped forward, just one step, measured, unhurried, the sound of her heels against the marble floor cutting clean through the silence, and Victor turned slightly toward her, not leading, not guiding, simply present. As if this moment had never belonged to anyone but her, and as the light held steady, no longer searching, no longer questioning, the room began to understand that it had not discovered her tonight. It had only finally seen what it had overlooked. The sound of her footsteps did not rush, did not echo loudly, but somehow it carried further than anything else in the room, each step precise, unshaken, as Sophia moved forward under the weightless certainty of the light now fixed upon her. And the crowd parted without being asked, not out of recognition yet, but instinct, as if something in her presence quietly demanded space without ever claiming it. Conversations dissolved into silence. Glasses remained untouched mid-air, and across the room, Ryan finally turned fully, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to place her within a version of reality that no longer fit, and for the first time that night, he was no longer the center of anything, not the story, not the attention, not even his own certainty. The host paused, allowing the moment to settle, his gaze shifting towards Sophia with a subtle nod that carried more weight than any introduction, and though he had not yet spoken her name, the room had already begun to feel it forming, unspoken but inevitable. Beside her, Victor remained a step behind, not hidden, not distant, but intentionally out of the light, his role defined not by presence, but by restraint, as though even he understood that this moment did not belong to him to share, only to witness. Sophia reached the front, the stage now only a few feet away, the soft glow of the spotlight outlining her in quiet clarity, and she paused, just briefly, not out of hesitation, but acknowledgment, as if honoring the distance she had traveled without needing anyone else to measure it for her. Ryan's voice almost surfaced, a reflex more than intention, but it stopped before it could take shape, because nothing about this moment invited interruption, and everything about it demanded stillness. The air itself seemed to hold, suspended between what had been assumed and what was about to be revealed, and as Sophia lifted her gaze toward the stage, her expression remained unchanged, calm, composed, untouched by the shift around her, as though she had never needed the room to see her in order to become who she already was, and now, finally, the room had no choice but to follow, where the light had chosen to stay. The final steps to the stage felt neither heavy nor rushed, but inevitable, as Sophia moved forward with the same quiet certainty that had carried her through years no one had witnessed, and when she reached the edge, the host finally spoke her name, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that cut through the room more deeply than applause ever could. Sophia Bennett, and the sound of it seemed to ripple outward, touching faces that shifted from polite curiosity to recognition too late to claim, and across the ballroom, Ryan's expression froze in place, the faint disbelief settling into something harder to hide, as if the name he had long erased had returned without asking for permission. The applause began again. But this time it was different, less automatic, more uncertain, growing as people adjusted their understanding of the moment they had nearly overlooked, and Sophia stepped onto the stage without reacting to it, her posture steady, her gaze level. Not searching for approval, not avoiding it, simply existing within it as if it had always been hers to carry. Victor remained just beyond the light, his presence still, composed, his role unchanged, not as the reason for her rise, but as the witness to it. And in that distance, the truth became unmistakable, that nothing about this moment had been given to her. It had been built, quietly, persistently, far from rooms like this one. The host extended a hand, offering her the center of the stage, but she did not rush to fill it. Instead, she allowed a brief pause to settle, a silence that felt fuller than any speech, and in that silence, the room adjusted once more, no longer seeing her as the woman they had ignored, but as someone they had failed to recognize. Ryan shifted slightly, as if to step forward or speak, but the moment had already moved beyond him, leaving him where he stood, outside of the story unfolding in front of him, and Sophia, standing in the light that had finally chosen her, did not look back, not because she was avoiding him, but because there was nothing left behind that required her attention. And as the spotlight held steady, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, the truth of who she had become needed no explanation, only presence. The room waited, not for noise, not for explanation, but for something far quieter, and Sophia stood at the center of it all without reaching for the microphone immediately. her fingers resting lightly against its edge as if even now she understood that presence mattered more than performance, and when she finally lifted her gaze across the audience, it did not linger on the faces that now watched her, it moved through them. Steady and composed, until for a brief second it passed over Ryan. Not with anger, not with triumph, but with a calm absence, the kind that comes when someone no longer holds a place in your story. The silence stretched just long enough to become meaningful, and then she spoke, her voice even, clear, carrying not force but certainty. "I did not lose my place," she said, the words settling into the room without resistance. "I just stopped standing where I was not seen, and there was no pause for applause, no invitation for reaction, because the truth in her voice did not ask for agreement. It simply existed. The spotlight held steady, framing her not as a revelation, but as something that had always belonged, and in that moment, the years of quiet rebuilding, of unseen effort, of mornings no one applauded and nights no one understood, all aligned into something undeniable, not a victory over anyone, but a return to herself. Somewhere at the edge of the stage, Victor remained still, his presence unchanged, not stepping forward, not claiming anything, and in that restraint, his role became clear, not as the source of her transformation, but as someone who had recognized it before the world did. The applause came slowly, not explosive, but real, growing as the room adjusted to a truth it could no longer ignore, and Sophia did not absorb it, did not lean into it. She simply allowed it to exist around her. Separate from who she was, Ryan stood motionless, the distance between them no longer measured in steps, but in everything that had changed, and everything that no longer connected them, and as the light remained fixed, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, Sophia stepped back just slightly, not retreating, but releasing the moment without holding onto it, her expression unchanged, her presence unshaken, as if the recognition had not elevated her, but simply confirmed what she had already become, and in the quiet that followed, one truth remained, clear and unspoken. She did not return to be seen, she returned because she never disappeared.